Now, before we get started, we just want to let you know this is not a traditional debate. The answers are not timed, but we may cut in if a candidate gets off topic.
All right, let's get started. A lot of our viewers have questions about both of your ad campaigns going negative. Viewers want to know how truthful the ads are. We want to give each of you a chance to defend your record. What was something inaccurate that was said about you in your opponent's ad? We're going to begin with Mr. Sutton.
You know, I think the first one that I would address is that my opponent's saying that I support a state income tax. That's just not true, unequivocally not true. I've supported decreasing taxes, working in the legislature 38 times, taxes and fees. And you know, the reality is if we want to talk about taxes, I think we should go there, because Congresswoman Noem has supported taxing or fee increases 57 times during her time in the legislature. She also was an architect of one of the biggest tax increases in South Dakota history, which was on ag property, $135 million and a 60% increase. And so I just want to set the record straight on that.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Noem.
You know, I would say that what Billy just said is probably the biggest inaccuracy that he has portrayed so far in the campaign. That ag tax that he talked about was actually a bill that I worked on to lower ag taxes. We were in a time of economic growth, and I know that from Billy's publicly supporting Bernie Sanders and his policies, maybe he doesn't understand economic growth and what it does, but it was really driving valuations up on our ag land. And I worked with ag organizations across the state to make sure that we were valuing our ag land on production and not on sales, which was literally taxing farmers off their land. If we had not passed that law, we would have much, much higher taxes today. And it was one of the things that every single ag organization supported and that we were very proud to get passed for our farmers and ranchers. The thing that's going to be devastating to farmers and ranchers in this state is if Billy's successful getting the income tax that he has advocated for. These farmers and ranchers are struggling to pay their bills today. The last thing they need is more money coming out of their pockets. And he says he doesn't support it, but we have it in his own words that he supported it. He's the leader of the Democratic Party in the state of South Dakota. It's in their platform. He even spent his own personal money to run a poll to figure out how to sell an income tax in the state of South Dakota. So we know that that's just the situation we're dealing with here with Billy, is that he says one thing but he does another, and that our ads are there to tell the truth and make sure that we really know what his voting record is and what his background is.
Mr. Sutton, give you a chance to rebuttal.
Again, I've never supported a state income tax, nor do I. The AP actually fact-checked this, and the ads that she's running are just not true. And you know, it's pretty clear that I don't support an income tax. South Dakota, as we've traveled the state, we've heard from South Dakotans they don't want an income tax. We're proud that we don't have an income tax. And so I stand with them. I do not support an income tax.
Yeah, and it is true. The people of South Dakota don't want an income tax. But Billy has clearly said he supports Bernie Sanders' policies and ideas. Everybody knows Bernie Sanders wants a 55% income tax in this country. He's a self-declared socialist. And his policies are not something that anybody in South Dakota wants to see happen here and change our way of life. So in his own words, he supported an income tax. He floated it as a revenue idea for the Blue Ribbon Task Force, and also to spend your own money polling and doing research to find out how to sell it in South Dakota shows that really Billy all along has been hoping that we could get an income tax here in the state of South Dakota.
Okay, we're going to move on to the next question. On day 100 of your term, what do you want to be your biggest accomplishment? Ms. Noem, you may go first.
Well, I would say that, first of all, the #1 job of a governor is to come into office and balance the budget and do it without raising taxes. You know, all along since I've been in public office, I've committed to the people of South Dakota that I believe in balancing the budget. I've signed a balanced budget amendment agreement that I believe that that's something we should be doing. That's something that Billy has not said that he would sign on to, doesn't believe in having a balanced budget amendment. And so I think that that's telling as to how we view the role of government in people's lives. So I think it's important that we make sure we're fiscally responsible, but also the next thing we need to do is go after infrastructure and internet and broadband development across the state. If we're going to recruit new businesses to South Dakota, help our small towns grow in the future, get families living there in our schools, we need to have internet service that's high speed and consistent so that they have the ability to do business there and help all parts and corners of South Dakota survive and thrive.
Thank you. Mr. Sutton, first 100 days, what would you want your biggest accomplishment to be?
You know, I think one of the biggest challenges that we face as a state is to clean up state government. We have heard and seen from a lot of the scandals that have been out there, whether it's Gear Up or EB5, or even the overturning of the will of the people with the anti-corruption measure. We need to make sure that we have an open, transparent, and accountable government. And those are things that I've fought for and I've brought in legislation to make sure we're open, transparent, and accountable, that we keep fiscal records for a longer period of time, that we make sure that, you know, one of the pieces of legislation that I passed and worked on was to make sure politicians can't walk away with their campaign cash. And I think that's really important to make sure that we do. So we reform campaign finance. And that's something that I'm really going to focus on as governor. And I think that that's something South Dakotans really care about.
Okay.
I do think that South Dakotans really do care about more transparency. It doesn't matter where you go in the state. They want to know they can trust their state government again. We've all heard about the EB-5 and Gear Up scandals, and Billy has sat on the oversight committee that was involved in making sure that the investigation was happening on Gear Up. What is interesting to me in watching what he says but then what he does is that while that investigation was going on and he was sitting on that oversight committee, he took thousands of dollars in campaign contributions from the defense attorneys involved in that scandal. To me, that shows me his character, that he wouldn't be willing to stop that kind of corruption from going forward.
I'm sure that doesn't have anything to do with the 100-day accomplishment, but we're going to give Mr. Sutton a chance to respond to that.
Congresswoman Noem actually took money from some of the people that were involved in consulting from Gear Up. So I don't think there is much room to, much wiggle room on this one. You know, the focus needs to be on cleaning up state government. I have a record of that, and I have fought corruption day in and day out. And the people of South Dakota know that. They know they can trust me to clean up state government. We can't trust Congresswoman Noem to do that because of the broken promises that we have seen throughout her campaign. Okay. She has promised to deliver a farm bill, which we have not seen. She has made campaign pledges that she's broken as far as taking campaign money.
Okay, I think we're getting a little off topic there, but we're going to talk about government corruption and transparency a little bit later on in the debate, but we want to go to our next question. The number of drug overdose deaths is expected to double in South Dakota this year. What is your plan to tackle the opioid crisis in the state? Would you consider signing a comprehensive opioid bill that dealt with addiction, punishment for dealers who product kills people, and better laws to assist families in helping their loved ones get treatment? Mr. Sutton.
Yeah, I've supported that legislation, and to make sure that we're getting people treatment, that needs to be our focus. That's what I've worked on during my time in the legislature. That's what I'm going to continue to do as governor, to make sure that we have the resources on the ground to address addiction and to get people help. We need to look at access to services West River. We need to look at drug courts. And those are the things that I'm going to focus on, working in partnership with the legislature, finding common ground to address a very serious issue. As part of that, too, I'm interested to see what the legislature comes up as it relates to access to mental health services. And I'm going to pick up on that and work with the legislature to find solutions. And that's going to be my focus as governor.
Ms. Noem.
We do have a terrible drug addiction, opioid and meth, and even alcoholism in the state of South Dakota, and a lack of treatment in many areas of the state. And so we need to be aggressive in making sure that we have services. I've supported a West River mental health facility and addiction treatment center so that we can have services available West River to deliver that to need, but also making sure that we have telehealth capabilities and counseling services in some of our smaller towns. Concerns that I have with this war on addiction that I really think that we need to have is that we need to be tough on crime when it happens as well, too. I was very proud that the Fraternal Order of Police endorsed me in this race, and I think they did because they view Billy as soft on crime. He supports legalizing marijuana, also supports amnesty. I think the 99% of the meth that comes into South Dakota comes from Mexico. And if we're allowing anybody to cross our borders and come into this country and come into South Dakota and bring drugs and illegal activity with them, that's very damaging to our way of life and our communities here in South Dakota.
Rebuttal, Mr. Sutton?
Yeah, what Congresswoman Noem said is just not true. I'm not soft on crime. We need to be smart on crime. That's why I supported the reforms that we've had and that we have seen be successful. The problem that we've had is we haven't provided the resources at the local level to make that happen. We need to do that, and that's going to be incredibly important that we work with the legislature to do that. So I refute that she's saying I'm soft on crime, because that is just not true.
Well,
okay,
and we're just simply talking about his voting records. So in his votes and his time in the state legislature, those are the types of votes that he's placed. And again, it's another instance where he's saying one thing now that he's running for governor, yet his background and what he's done has been different.
All right, we got to move on. Thank you both. Taxes are something our viewers keep asking us about, and we're going to get some answers for you.
Well, We'll ask the candidates about that and other hot-button issues. Our South Dakota gubernatorial debate continues in less than 2 minutes.